Welcome to Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions. I'm Trevor Bechtel, facilitator of this series with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan and instructor of the course that accompanies the series. Over these next 6 weeks, we will introduce key issues regarding the causes and consequences of poverty in this virtual space, featuring experts in policy and practice from across the nation. We are an audience of students enrolled in our course, community members, academics, policymakers, and interested people from Southeast Michigan and beyond. And we are really excited about today's session that puts Jeremy Levine in conversation with Alex Murphy and Kristin Seefeld about his new book, Constructing Community. We're happy to present this in partnership with the Departments of Sociology and Organizational Studies. But before we dig into the conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions and comments in the comment box to the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #UMPovertySolutions. We look forward to a meaningful conversation and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue, and we want to let folks know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. I invite you to check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty research at our website, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, I'd like to introduce Alex Murphy, Assistant Professor of Sociology, who will introduce our speaker and respondent.
Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jeremy, my friend and colleague. Jeremy Levine is an Assistant Professor of Organizational Studies and Sociology at the University of Michigan. He earned his PhD at Harvard in sociology and was a doctoral fellow in the Inequality and Social Policy program at the Kennedy School. Jeremy got his undergrad degree at Michigan in sociology, so this is very much home for him. Jeremy's work broadly engages in the politics of poverty and inequality, primarily in US cities. And he's published in numerous places, from the American Sociological Review and Social Science Quarterly to Social Forces. His work has been covered in the New York Times, the Atlantic City Lab, the Boston Globe, Nonprofit Quarterly, among others. And so today what I'm really delighted to do is to have this conversation about his latest publication, which is Constructing Community, his new book. I've read this book. I've had the pleasure of reading this book at various stages, and it's a wonderful book it's really pushed me to think in new directions. And I think it makes a really great, significant contribution to our understanding about how urban inequality gets reproduced through organizations and systems of governance today. So Jeremy, for those, I want to just kick it off by saying, for those who haven't read the book, can you tell us a little bit about the book? Tell us about Fairmount Corridor, which you studied, and tell us about the research that you did in Boston, and give us a sense of sort of the big picture takeaways of the book.
Yeah, thanks, first of all, for the introduction, Alex. Thanks to Poverty Solutions for putting on this great event, and also to Kristin, who'll be giving comments later. So thanks all of you for putting all this together. So for this book, I studied an area in Boston called the Fairmount Corridor. This is a 9-mile rail corridor. It runs through the neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. There's about 8 sub-neighborhoods within there. The 2 endpoints are largely industrial. And between them are 6 residential neighborhoods, predominantly low income, predominantly non-white, that were the focal points of a lot of community development projects. Things like the building of new rail stations on that rail line, new affordable housing, new commercial development, new what's called open space or green space, like gardens, parks, bike paths, and that kind of stuff. And for this book, I thought this corridor was a really interesting and helpful space to understand a few key questions related to urban poverty. And really, the sort of emphasis was on, as Alex, you mentioned, governance. Who it was that was calling the shots for these projects, who, in other words, governs. And then after understanding that, thinking then about the implications for what it all meant for democratic representation and inequality. So in the book, I spent 4 years of ethnographic fieldwork following all the different players that were vying to have a say along or about these projects. Folks from local community organizations, philanthropic foundations, government officials at city, state, and the federal government, residents that were vying to have a say as well. And after those 4 years, putting it all together, trying to make sense of these questions, in the book, I put forward 2 arguments. The first is that to this question of who governs, it's to a larger extent than I had really anticipated or expected. The nonprofit sector governs quite a bit, in some ways on par with public officials and elected representatives. Not just community organizations, but foundations, intermediaries, all of their consultants. This whole space of the nonprofit sector plays a massive, important role in determining what happens in poor neighborhoods. Now, with that comes the second argument, which is that there are some good things that can come from that, but there's also some downsides, particularly when we think of democratic representation. These are non-elected, nonprofit leaders that are having a big say over the distribution of public resources and what happens in poor neighborhoods. And then secondarily, this is also having a really important effect on inequality, insofar as these organizations do a good job of funneling resources to poor neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods that don't have these organizations, or where they are lacking capacity, where they sort of lack the leadership to get stuff done, they will be at a structural disadvantage to even compete for resources for their neighborhoods, let alone get them and bring them to their neighborhoods. So altogether, it is making engaging in some of these debates and discussions about urban poverty, who gets what, and really focusing on those people that are making the decisions and distributing the resources.
Jeremy, I want to sort of step back and ask you a question about how we got to this point. So one of your big takeaways is that urban development policy has changed considerably over the last 70 years, such that poor communities ostensibly have a stronger voice and more representation than ever before. What were some of the major transformations that made community development in poor neighborhoods different today than in the past?
Yeah, great question. So if we go back 70 years ago to a time period at the beginning of what is known as urban renewal, this was governments, mostly city governments subsidized by a state and federal government, finding what they were calling slum neighborhoods. I use scare quotes, intentionally here. What they identified as slum neighborhoods, which were predominantly lower income, non-white, or what we now think of as sort of white immigrants, Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, and funneling a ton of public resources into those neighborhoods to essentially demolish them, construct new communities whole cloth. So in the case of Boston, the famous case is the West End, which is a neighborhood that now basically doesn't exist. There's a couple remaining buildings. It was a primarily Irish and Italian neighborhood. And so the idea was to revitalize and build new neighborhoods that were better, right? Very top down. And the legacy has been one of straight up destruction. In response to that, organizations emerged, local organizations that were trying to have a better voice for the local community and local residents in these development decisions, so that they weren't getting quite literally bulldozed over with highways, with new buildings and the like. And this also was something that President Kennedy, as we get into the 1960s, thought was really good too. And his brother Robert as well thought this was a really good thing. We should support more of this. So part of the war on poverty, one of the big innovations was funneling more money into certain kinds of community-based organizations, direct pipeline from the federal government, to do the kinds of community development work that I studied contemporaneously, right? The stuff like building new housing, the brick and mortar sort of thing. These organizations are called community development corporations, are the particular brand, although I studied other ones as well. But they do a lot of this sort of like ostensibly community-driven local development, getting the residents' voice on the table. And since that period of the war on poverty, the inclusion of nonprofits has only accelerated. So whereas today, to say that like nonprofits are involved, that's no different than it's been for 50 years now, right? The extent to which nonprofits are involved, the extent to which nonprofits now have been around for 40 years that are doing some of this development work, they're doing the resident organizing, are now highly professionalized, having been around for so long, are part and parcel of the governance apparatus, is sort of like taking that 1960s war on poverty model on steroids. That's a huge change. Another big change has been the role of philanthropy being a big piece of this as well. Another side of the nonprofit sector. We don't necessarily think about them as nonprofits often, but they are indeed part of this sector, both funding it and having a say themselves. And then the third and final massive transformation I think is really important for this has been the growth of participatory processes in redevelopment projects. So again, if we go back to that urban renewal period, if we think about the West End in Boston, there weren't a whole lot of meetings for people to sort of come and say, hey, no, we don't want the bulldozers coming and demolishing our apartments. Now, though, that is part and parcel of projects, to the extent that they are effective, to the extent that they actually empower poor residents of neighborhoods, is something that I challenge and grapple with and discuss in the book. But at least on paper, the structure of governance now is such that this is part of the way that things are done.
Right. So I want to push you on this. So, you just said that communities have more voice, more power ostensibly than they have ever before. And that's good. That's, something that I think everyone would agree with. But you also, in the book, make a strong and somewhat unexpected critique of community control itself. And, I think most of us think that poor communities should control the development projects that happen in their neighborhoods. And so I'm wondering if are you saying that the community shouldn't control development in their neighborhoods, or what is this critique all about?
Yeah, right. So what's not in the book, and it's the backstory. So here's the sort of inside baseball, like tea for all of you, to sort of really go what I was thinking. And here's where I'm coming from with this. So I'd read a lot of this work, obviously, because I was interested in it, the research that had already been done, cared about these issues, had learned about it in class at the University of Michigan as an undergraduate student myself, learned about it in grad school as a graduate student, and writing response papers as an undergrad, writing term papers, moving on to grad school, doing the same sort of thing. My go-to when it came to any of these issues about urban poverty and urban inequality was to say, we need to empower the community. The community should decide. It was the answer. It was always the answer. And as I started to do this field work and this research, I had that same sort of inclination behind me, right? That's how this should all work. And increasingly over those 4 years of doing the field work, I became increasingly dissatisfied with that answer. And not that it was wrong, but that it was wholly insufficient. So that's really the critique. And so I'll give an example. In watching these things and these projects unfold, the process generally works. Let's say there is a plot of land in a neighborhood. So there is an abandoned lot, right, in one of these neighborhoods I studied. So the question was, okay, what should we do there? And the way the process typically works is, rather than in the past when we might have government dictating top down, this is what we're going to do, there's again a participatory process. There's a set of meetings that are held. Nonprofits are solicited by local or state government, whoever owns that property or that plot of land, to organize the community, to get local people out, to come to a meeting, to maybe decide what's going to be in a request for proposals, or maybe meet with developers and sort of say, we don't want that, we want that instead. So I watched these unfold, and the first thing that was so immediate to me, so these are community meetings with the community that comes to participate and have the community's voice. The thing that struck first was the sort of what we all would expect, is that often people may say things and that those in power sort of circumvent them or sort of disregard them. But also the second thing that came through was that what people wanted was a lot of different things that were often irreconcilable and sort of, you can't have both. So for instance, in one particular plot of land, the community came to a community meeting and said, we want affordable housing here. Another group or a couple people at that same community meeting, the community who showed up, said, we have too much affordable housing in this neighborhood. This is a poor neighborhood. It's a low income neighborhood. You're segregating us from everyone else. We should have mixed income housing. Yet another group said, what we need actually is jobs. We don't need housing here. We need jobs. So we should have commercial development that has quotas for local residents to be employed at whatever business is. You see where we're going with this. Everyone can't win here, right? The community did not have a singular position. So to me, one of the problems with community control, elevating the voice of the community and the way that it gets sort of bureaucratized in these processes of governance, that's both the fault of government and nonprofits that organize the community, is that to even have such a thing as the community controlling something, there needs to be such a thing as the community. And when the community is a bunch of different people, that may even have varying incomes, even though it's a predominantly poor neighborhood. Even if they share those demographics, they may have different positions about certain mundane things. Most of these projects were not sort of existential crises of like, are we going to have luxury gentrified housing, or are we going to have housing for us, right? That the day-to-day of ultimately I studied 61 projects and planning processes. The day-to-day and vast majority of these that happen, it's not these existential crises. It's like, should we have 2 floors or 3 floors? Should we have 1.5 parking spaces or 2 parking spaces per apartment, right? And what does that mean? And so in some ways, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of how the community actually engages and thinks about things, the assumption that there is going to be such a thing as a singular voice is problematic. And if we then don't assume that, then all of these sort of ideas and policies about community control in some ways fall apart, or they sort of sift through our hands like sand. They're hard to really grasp and make tangible and actionable when people think different things.
So that all makes sense to me, but I don't really know what to do with that. So let's say I'm a foundation officer, and let's say that I'm a elected representative, and I really want to bring resources into a community and help it flourish. Given what you're saying, who should I listen to? How do I figure out what we should do? How do we maximize? Maybe there's not the community, but how do you suggest that we maximize meeting the most people's needs, or adjudicating between the different needs of people? Or is just the issue that we should stop thinking about the community altogether? And if we think of, is it that we need a different approach and process to engage the community, or is it that we need a different way of thinking about the community itself, or maybe it's both? Yeah. What do I do if you're a consultant to the Boston Foundation and you want to make sure that we're not making the mistakes that you document in the book? How do we do better?
So there's 2 layers to this question. One is the vested interest of, if you're an elected official or someone at the Boston Foundation or foundation officer, how you should operate, or even a community organizer, compared to the sort of what I think we might need to be doing. And so the reason why I distinguish that is because part of the play on words here of the title is that all of these different players, from foundations to government to community organizers and so on, are constructing this idea of community and the singular community voice. They're either constructing it in a way to say that I represent the community and so you should listen to me, or they're constructing it in a way that they're saying, well, what we're doing is for the community, so you should support what it is that we're doing. Let's say, so if you're government, they're not necessarily saying we're representing the community, they're saying we're doing what's best for the community, right? And so in those people, they have a vested interest in the assumption and the operationalization of community as if it's a singular sort of entity. It has great sort of moral worth, right? Like, community sounds great. Why wouldn't you want to represent the community? And why wouldn't you talk about empowering the community, right? Specifically. And so this is where things get a little thorny. To be honest with you, like a lot of their success, and like, for instance, a foundation's ability to have a say in this is dependent in many ways, not just on them having the money to be able to put up for this. That's part of it. That's insufficient. It's also about saying that, like, we are here in part as partners with the community, right? So for them to sort of then say there's no such thing as the community, there's a lot of different voices and we have whatever, it kind of goes against their ability to have a say in these processes. So that's sort of like my analytical hat on, right? Of like, if I was actually sort of doing it, I may tell them, don't listen to Jeremy. Like, he's not going to help us have a bigger say, assuming, right, that we want a bigger say. Now, if I'm me and I'm actually sort of saying what I think might sort of be a better approach, I think you nailed it, that it is both and thinking about this in a different way such that we then have a different approach and process. So if we think about and understand, look, people in a given neighborhood, again, given similar demographics, aren't necessarily going to have the same position about certain things. So to assume that there's such a thing of the community, we should like get rid of that language and really talk about who it is, right? So like in some of these neighborhoods, yes, they may be predominantly low income, predominantly non-white, but there are white middle-class people who live in these neighborhoods that are point blank, end of sentence, community members. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? Now, we may say they are more privileged community members. They already have other avenues to have a say, and so we want to empower other people. But then we should say that, right? And I think, so that's the sort of changing the idea, the sort of way to think about it. But then in terms of like actionable stuff and like different approach and processes, I think there it's about getting away from the processes that are not just assuming, but like motivated by and getting towards consensus. So the way that like a community meeting is run or hope to be run, like if you come out of a community meeting and people like that example I just gave, like what do you do with what do you do with that, right? Like, how do you work that into a request for proposals? If you want to empower the community and everyone's saying, different things, like what do you do with that? And I think the problem is because it's assuming there's such a thing as consensus. It's assuming that that's optimal, that like, it's better if we have, our processes will work if we have an actionable sort of agenda item out of it, right? If there's conflict, it sort of falls, not that there's conflict, if there's difference of opinion, it sort of falls apart. That's not to say that shouldn't be conflict or whatever, but like, they aren't really geared towards, again, that's where differences. What if instead, though, we thought not about consensus as the optimal goal, but thought about instead about getting more priorities on the table? What about instead of thinking like, how do we get the one idea? How do we get like 20 ideas, right? And what if instead of thinking about like, how do we get go through a process? Yeah, it's a public meeting. And then at the end of it, have this idea that the community said, that the community organizations can sort of get out. What if you had something else that was a little bit more transparent, where you could see those priorities, where there was a way to interact with those priorities, maybe some sort of ranking type of thing? And there's a couple different models that I saw over the course of my fieldwork that I thought were really interesting. One I saw actually in the Fairmount Quarter. It was a cool art display where, to sort of, gloss over all the details. Basically, it was what should we do to beautify this transit station area, this sort of platform. And there was a bunch of different ideas, and people that were moving by could sort of put their little popsicle sticks in these cups to sort of vote. And you can see which one had a lot of popsicle sticks or which one didn't. There's other ways to think about doing this online and with sort of survey type stuff, crowdsourcing type things that work as well. But the point is you're able to get a lot more transparency. You see priorities. The point of it is to show many priorities, not sort of get toward an agreement on one. And then I think that also leads to transparency, assuming that at the end of the day, if this is a publicly owned place and there's an agency that has to make a decision about it at some point, maybe more throughout the process, you get most of the popsicle sticks that say, we want on this plot of land or the voting or whatever, we want luxury housing. That would be, in my estimation, and perhaps to many city or state government officials, whoever's controlling this, not great either, and assuming they are worried about gentrification. And maybe they may say no, that yes, this process yielded this. There was also a lot of support for a mixed income housing or something else. And we think that's the way to go. It forces them to be transparent as well, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to do luxury housing because it's what the community wanted, or, oh, we're going to do something else because it's what the community wanted. And there's no way to verify. There's no way to challenge that. Mm-hmm. So it's a way that gets out of community meetings, these sort of set time and place where you're geared towards one outcome, right? It assumes it works if you have that, to one where it works if you don't have that. Yeah. And I think that's going to and to me, I think that gets past a lot of these problems of who to choose and who to make sense of or whatever. You're making a lot of that a lot more transparent.
Yeah. So speaking of who to choose, we have a great question from Emily Tuesday, who says that in Ypsilanti, we see Ann Arbor nonprofits creating programs and making decisions for our community. They have the resources and the power to successfully receive grants intended for our community, Ypsilanti. Did you see something similar in the neighborhood you studied? I know you did, and I would love to hear more about that, and also what we do about that.
Yeah, okay. So there's, all of these questions, layers, right? So yes. And so first, I want to get a little heady, a little theoretical, challenge the assumption buried within that question, and then talk about a way that I agree with the underlying problem that's sort of insinuated in that question, and think about sort of ways to sort of get past it. So first is one of the big sort of points of the book, and part of that play on words and constructing community that I was sort of getting at, is kind of putting myself out there a bit on a ledge to say that there's no such thing. Not only do these organizations that claim to represent the community, not fully represent them. So I buy that, I'm down with that, I get it. Also, I extend that a little bit further. And I would argue actually that no one can represent the community. And that's kind of the point, right? So I think there's an idea often where there's critiques of bureaucratized, professionalized nonprofits that maybe their director, it doesn't necessarily live in the neighborhood where they work, but some staff do. So it's community-based, again, scare quotes used intentionally here. Often the argument to sort of fix that is they should have more community governance. They should be run by residents, right? There should be more resident involvement. But this goes back to exactly what Alex, you and I were just talking about, or what I was saying in response to one of your questions, which is that like, okay, but then who? Why do we assume one person? Why do we assume anyone, period, can be the representative of a given community? Just because it's a poor neighborhood doesn't mean everyone thinks the same, and doesn't mean there can be sort of self-appointed or otherwise appointed leaders any more than there can be in a more affluent neighborhood. So in some ways, I'm saying, like, yes, I agree with that. That can be a problem. It's like outsiders bringing in represented the community when, you know, they may not be fully of them or as grassrootsy as we sort of might like or normatively sort of think is better. But also I would challenge the sort of implicit assumption in there that anyone can do that. But then I would actually take a sort of at the third level, like another step further, and say part of the solution then isn't then like sort of solving this and finding the right leader, but more about a lot of different leaders. So to me, one of the problems is when we take representation, and so you think about this like political representation, right? So I live in Ann Arbor. I have a city council member, you know, and above her, I have a state representative, right? You know, there's layers, right, of representation. When it comes to things like nonprofits that are claiming to represent neighborhoods, local community organizations, whether or not they're like more bureaucratized, more professionalized, or more grassrootsy, you don't have that same sort of layering, right? It's sort of singular neighborhood representatives. They're like, we're the representatives of these poor neighborhoods. It's a big finding sort of that I saw, and we're going to bring the resources in there, sometimes for good, sometimes to the ambivalence of people, which is okay, and sometimes against maybe what some people had wanted, right? To sort of some protest around it. So again, I think the solution then to this third level isn't so much like let's fix them or find a better one, but let's have more. So the problem with this isn't so much which one, but that there's one. Right. So it's not sort of making that one better, but having space for there to be more. And so to me, this is the big macro problem, is that we have sort of a world in urban governance where the sort of like good community partner that's going to work nice with public officials is the one that gets a seat at the table. The more sort of contentious politics, grassrootsy, protest driven, not sort of as polite, you know, fewer MSWs and MPPs that are leading sort of these organizations. They need to sit at the table too for like a range. It's sort of like a let a thousand flowers bloom sort of perspective. And I also like the idea too of having like citywide organizations that aren't just sort of representing a particular neighborhood, that maybe are thinking about issues like eviction or the environment and can sort of have more sort of coalition type of stuff. So to me, like my world isn't so much like, let's get the best one neighborhood organization to be the one representative. I think that has problems no matter who it is. And rather to think about how do we get like a cornucopia of groups that can engage in coalitions around particular issue areas and then can be together pressuring government either nicely or contentiously or a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, but what do we do about, and one of the things that Emily's question is raising is the fact that there are some organizations that have more capacity to receive grants, to apply for the grants, to receive them. And what you say in your book is that, in fact, foundations and funders want to give the grants to those kinds of organizations because they're more likely to be successful because they have the capacity. And so there's sort of this catch-22. And then you have some communities that don't have high capacity organizations and so aren't well positioned. So how do we, there's a question of what happens within communities, but how do we create broader equality across communities given how different some communities are in terms of their capacity?
Yeah, that's a great point. And also like brings in, I think, an incredibly important actor here, which is the funders, particularly foundations, philanthropy, and other sort of intermediaries that are sort of working alongside foundations, repackaging funding and giving it to sort of local nonprofits. So this is like a larger sort of structural problem. And I almost just sort of gave it away in that description, talking about these intermediaries. So often the way I came into this, I thought about the world of funding as a sort of like, there are big, powerful funders. There's like Ford Foundation, and they give a grant and they determine what happens. And they have a big, powerful role. This is driven in part from a lot of the great research. A lot of historians have talked about this in the 1960s. Like that's the game, right? For thinking about urban poverty. So I came in thinking about the all-powerful foundation, top-down, dictating what's going to happen. And yeah, there's a little bit of that, and it still happens. That still happens, of course. And there was a bit of that in the Fairmount corridor. But what I was surprised to find was that a lot of the work happens with multiple grants. So a singular project may have some subsidies from the state, may have some help with the city, may get $100,000 from one foundation, 500 from another, some from another. So you have a lot of pooling, packaging, and a lot of foundations and funders who are literally working together as people saying, let's coordinate our grants to have sort of the biggest impact we can have. Now, what does that mean when you have these sort of networks essentially of funders who might fund to another funder who might bring in money from some more funders and give it then ultimately to a grantee? Well, it means that your funders aren't just funders. It means for the ultimate sort of nonprofit that's creating a program, making decisions, getting money, applying for grants, those grants aren't just coming from one space. They're coming from multiple places. But even that singular grant that they get from one funder may actually have seeded money from a few other funders further up the network chain, right? So what that means practically for this work is that a lot of these funders then were incentivized. I mean, they're always incentivized to sort of show success. But part of what we might hope for foundations, philanthropy with deep pockets that don't have public oversight is that they can do things that may not show those results. They may sink a lot of money into a very tricky, tough neighborhood poverty project that may not have obvious success that's going to come out of it, right? That would be our hope. But when you're a funder, a foundation that's also getting a couple $100,000 from some other funders, pooling that together with some of your own money and then giving that to a grantee, you're going to choose the grantee that's going to make you look good because you have to turn around and after that project happens, talk to your funders. This is, I think, most prominent with the folks like LISC and Enterprise, which are national intermediaries. They get a carve out from the federal government, from HUD every year. And so like they're put in this position where they are incentivized not necessarily, and really not at all, to put their money where they look at a map, they look at the neighborhood, they look at Boston and say, that's where the greatest need is. We're going to go there. It's more, who can we fund that's going to show a successful project? Mm-hmm. So what does that mean then? It means they're going to go to the places that are the most, have that, again, the highest capacity, that already have a lot of money from other funders. You have this agglomeration sort of thing happening. Mm-hmm. Funders in general, this is even bigger than just this. But like funders in general, this is a sort of massive problem, like to fund project-based grants in general, rather than like a capacity grant. So then you're caught in this sort of endless cycle, right? So not only are you incentivized by this larger structure, this network of funding distributions, but also you want to see projects because at the end of the year, you have an annual report that you want to show off about how great you are and what awesome work your foundation is doing. If you sink, a couple $1 million to build capacity in a neighborhood that doesn't have a great vital, sort of high vitality, community organizational basis, what are you going to put in your pamphlets, right? Now, I'm saying they could. I'm not saying this is like legitimate. I think they should change this. But from their perspective, that's how they're thinking. And so, as a result, it means, in my case, in the case of the Fairmount Corridor, there's a neighborhood in the corridor of Mattapan that had its local community development organization. It went bankrupt halfway through my field work, didn't have a whole lot else going on. Since then, there's been a few things that have bubbled up as a result, but funders were very explicit. We are not giving any money for capacity. We are not going to help you build your organization up if we don't know how it's going to result in successful projects. So this puts other groups, right, at a structural disadvantage, and neighborhoods that don't have those long established, already well-funded nonprofits to sort of get up and get up and going.
Yep. And this is, just sort of selfishly, I think about this a lot because as poverty is rising in the suburbs, where there aren't huge nonprofit capacities and organizations are trying to figure out, how to start up, there's no money anymore for capacity grants. And so you have, this creates further inequality between cities and suburbs and raises the question of what are we going to do in these suburbs given sort of how funding currently operates and is rewarded. So this is a great conversation, and I want to just pause for a minute and bring our brilliant colleague, Kristin Seefeld, into it. So Kristin is the Associate Professor of Social Work, an Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Ford School. She's also the Associate Director of Educational Programs for Poverty Solutions. Kristin is the author of 5 different books that explore how low-income individuals understand their situations, especially as it pertains to work and economic well-being. And one of my favorite books that she's written is Abandoned Families, which explores the ways in which various institutions that once fostered economic security and upward mobility currently fail low and moderate income families, particularly families of color. So Kristin, welcome to the conversation. We're very excited to have you here. Given the depth of your work on poverty, and your extensive experience working in cities, especially Detroit. I know Jeremy and I are very excited to have your perspective on this conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to engage with this work. And Jeremy's really written a really fascinating book that I really encourage all of you who are on the video right now to go out and get a copy, because it's a great and interesting read. And it really, I think, for me, centrally pushed me to really think about what do I mean by the term community. I realize I use it all the time. And yes, it's a very ill-defined, kind of elusive term, and yet it's very taken for granted. And I, was thinking about how we define it could really be quite different depending on the situation or circumstance and the issue at hand. So when I think about the area that Jeremy studied, maybe if the issue we're really concerned about would be noise from construction and property values, we might have one definition of community. But if we're talking about like potential job opportunities, the definition of community might get broader. But I really appreciated just having that space to think about, like, wow, this is really important. And I think he really raises another related important point in making us think about like the real pitfalls of depending on larger organizations to serve as proxies for the community voice. And that, I was just looking at Poverty Solutions' own website, and, community is something we feature very centrally in terms of our sort of theory of change. And, we say we engage with community organizations. Well, there's a whole strand of research called community-based participatory research, which typically too thinks of community as being organizationally based. So we really, I think, do need to specify who it is we're talking about when we are using the term community, and think very carefully about then who's getting left out. But then, as Jeremy points out in the book, and he noted this again in his comments, the more inclusive that we get, the wider that we cast the net for community, the more likely it is we're going to get contradictory messages. And I sort of love that example of, one group in one corner is saying, no, we want affordable housing. Another group says, no, not affordable housing, and consensus is never reached. That said, if we really do care about reaching the most marginalized, and ultimately if we care about ameliorating inequality, then we really need to be mindful of not just listening to the usual suspects, and listening to those who do come to all the meetings. They might be a very different group. I also found, one of his more larger points about democratic processes really interesting. That nonprofits can't be elected out of office if we're unhappy with the results that they did or didn't bring us. But then I was wondering, is this always necessarily a bad thing? Community development projects in particular take years or often decades, right? And we want these efforts to be able to withstand political turnover and shifts in administrations. So as kind of left wondering, are there ways that we could better hold nonprofits accountable? Like what would that look like to have some standards in place that that we could kind of not hold organizations' feet to the fire, but bring them in to look more democratically accountable. I really, in the conclusion to the book, really appreciated a lot of the really creative ways that Jeremy highlights to gather ideas and have this sort of marketplace for ideas. And I love that example with the cups and the popsicle sticks and that art solution, art installation. I'm still left a little bit thinking about, like, what exactly do you do with the 20 different ideas? And do you then still end up with the same problem of having some group of people being unhappy? And what do you do if that group of people who are unhappy happen to be those who have more power, relatively speaking? The last thing that I'll highlight, and particularly for those of us in the audience who are researchers, and especially for anyone who might be a doctoral student or thinking about going into a doctoral program, I really encourage you to get the book, if for nothing else, to read the methodological appendix. I appreciate the transparency with which Jeremy approached that. And I think it really captures a lot of the challenges and opportunities of doing field work, sort of the highs and the lows, and some of the creative decisions that Jeremy was faced with during his time in the field. And so on its own, I think that's a terrific addition to the field. So I want to really congratulate Jeremy on his important work. It has significant implications for how we think about urban governments and the role of non-governmental actors. And finally, again, how we operationalize the term community and the consequences of the decision for how we do that. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to raise a question that we haven't really covered, and that comes from the audience. So we've talked a lot about community and what constitutes it and who is it and who isn't it and how it's everyone but no one. And we've talked a lot about organizations and how they're both great, but also they're problematic, and how they don't have a lot of constraints, and that's both good and bad. But we haven't talked a lot about elected officials and what role they play. And so we got a question from Rebecca Nykodem, who says that you discuss in your book that private nonprofit community development organizations have become the de facto representatives of neighborhoods, more so than the democratically elected representatives in office. And in Detroit, given the very large geographic size of the council districts, and also considering that a council member recently pled guilty to bribery and resigned from office, and another resigned earlier this year after pleading guilty to misconduct in office, Rebecca wants to know, how would you suggest altering the political structure in a place like Detroit or Boston or somewhere to make council members or other elected officials more representative of neighborhoods? And Rebecca says, would you think about creating more districts? Do we need more representatives, just like we need more organizations? Or do we need a different system altogether? What, Jeremy, is your takeaway on how to make elected representatives more effective representatives of the people who vote for them?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I think reveals in some ways massive hole when it comes to doing social science research, which is that we're awesome in many ways. I think we're awesome, not necessarily myself, but my colleagues, at like identifying all the problems. But then it's like, okay, now solve them. Rethink government, rethink sort of the distribution of public resources. And then we get a little tricky, and often sort of we slap on a few things in our conclusions, and it's often unsatisfying, but we do our best. So that's a somewhat long way of saying that I'm gonna craft an answer, and I have some things to say, but I'm largely sort of thinking through this in some ways with you, Rebecca, and with everyone else, and just sort of based on what I saw, what sort of some of my thoughts will be. So I think this ties in really well to how Alex introduced the question, which is highlighting not so much this is good, this is bad, something else would be better or worse or good or bad, but rather that all of these things have often inherent contradictions, inherent tensions. So like the rise of community-based organizations as, in my argument, on par with elected representatives as representing poor neighborhoods has frankly a lot of great things that come with that. More representation, it sort of is able to circumvent the sort of corrupt politicians that may exist, not just in Detroit, but cities across the country. Boston also had a bribery scandal that preceded my field work, but it happens. And this is a way where, like, great, like we want to be empowering them, because then We don't have it being in the hands of someone who like might be corrupt. On the other hand, then we're sacrificing the ability to elect, appoint, vote out, your representative. And so it's really just like a fundamental inherent tension and not something that goes away. So to me, the way I think about this isn't so much about like, how do we get rid of the tensions, but how do we somehow, like avoid the negative externalities or think about what the negative consequences are and either jigger things differently or like do something else on top of it that sort of would, change that issue. And so to me, the issue and the problem is the superseding. So I use that word intentionally. Now, I don't think the elected representatives in my study would agree necessarily with that portrayal. I'd be curious to know. One of them who's quoted, who I actually worked with in the mayor's office during my field work, is now one of the 2 finalists to be mayor of Boston. I hope she checks out the book. That'd be awesome. And I wonder what she might think about this. But to me, the big problem is in this larger system, the local nonprofits being seen as more the person who you turn to understand and represent a particular neighborhood over elected representatives. And so part of that is challenging this assumption that like representatives are more or less or sort of can be somehow like more representative. It's the same sort of argument that I give with the organizations, right? There's no sort of prototypical. Political scientists have actually studied this quite extensively, that a lot of policy positions and a lot of policy that happens that lawmakers, what they think is often very different than what public opinion is. Their perception and their staff perception of public opinion is often really at odds. There's a couple that would call this democracy by coincidence often. So even in the more like great sort of systems that we have, or the sort of some of the more better places, you still will have sort of this challenge. So to me, it's not like about like the better one or having one, but it's about like sharing the space. And it's about sort of like having those in public office that can be held publicly accountable, and in part having the nonprofits, rather than superseding them, being the ones that are holding them in part publicly accountable, that are organizing things, if they're corrupt and not doing what is representative, that are these organizations are there empowered to sort of, let that be known or push back against that. So it's almost more like, I'll again, inside baseball, a little T here, a reviewer did refer to this as a little Pollyannish. But, like, what can I say? I think it'd be much a better world if, like, we had a little bit more of a sharing thing. And to me, I see that sort of more as the problem, as a superseding, right? Because we can imagine, again, a place where, like, superseding a corrupt politician is awesome, but it comes with a lot of costs. So I sort of think it as, like, how do we figure out a way to have more of a sort of balance and more of a checks and balance against different sort of sectors?
Well, a different question, Jeremy, is, your book is exclusively, it's very focused on community development. And so do you think that what you find in terms of the role of elected officials and nonprofits hold for other concerns that matter to a neighborhood outside of community development?
Right, exactly. So like there's a lot of sort of bread and butter things that happen in neighborhoods where elected officials are super important. And, I would never say basically that they don't matter, period, full stop, right? Never would say that. And to say superseding often gives this sort of assumption, right, that like, they don't have power or whatever, but they're also like ceding a lot of that power in part because in a lot of these spaces, nonprofits are doing the work. Think about stuff like even social service provision, government contracting, right? Like the work is being carried out by others. And that, particularly like in community development, which, community development's one area, but also touches a lot of different areas. A lot of them are doing programs that look just like social service programs. Yes, they're doing housing, but they're also doing environmental sustainability type of stuff as well. And so cross-sects transportation policy, cross-sects of a lot of different things. But sort of, I guess the upshot here is it's not so much, right, that like the elected officials don't matter. They're not important. They're irrelevant, particularly in other areas. It's more so that we kind of have a world where it's normal, routine, not uncommon for there to be deference to local organizations, whether it's in the community development space, social service space, education space, wherever. And a space where they're coming up with stuff first, and then elected officials are sort of riding the coattails moving forward. So I think it's something that can transcend, but like there's a lot of things that are pretty unique to this. There's a lot of stuff like where education, thinking about evaluation metrics and how that affects where funding goes is very different than this sort of stuff. And so I try to make actually in the book, to your point, I try to like make this as much as I possibly can. Like, yes, I'm trying to speak to a larger sort of trend of stuff. I think it relates to a lot of other areas, but there are points where like, yeah, this feels very community development-y, and so it may sort of not align with other areas. So to me, it's like research really, it's like, let's put stuff out, get as deep as you can in one particular area. And then there may be pieces that are resonate with other areas, and there may be pieces that don't. But to be as transparent as possible is how we sort of make sense of it all.
So Jeremy, we have a couple of questions, both one from McKenna Lambert, and also Rebecca has a question that is in the same vein, which is basically, you know, you've talked a lot about community and engaging community in different ways, but what do we do about people who are harder to reach, who don't come to the meetings, who can't get there because they work 2 jobs, who can't get there because they have, you know, the irony of they can't get to the meeting because they don't have transportation to talk about transportation related ideas for the neighborhood. You know, what are some ways we can promote community involvement or in either areas or among people who are hard to reach? How do we get their voices?
Yeah. This is where, like, I think the book is adding to some existing conversations that have been critiquing the public participatory process, public meetings, and so on, largely driven by my friends and colleagues, Katie Einstein, Max Palmer, David Glick, political scientists at BU, have this amazing book that I think everyone should read as well, Neighborhood Defenders, and done phenomenal research on top of the book as well. That's looking basically kind of at what you're hinting at, what Kristin hinted at as well, or got at, sort of like who's there, the kinds of people that are showing up. In their research, it is what you might expect given our conversation. The people that are showing up and they're focusing in part a bit on housing, but the people that are showing up are homeowners who are white and more affluent than, you know, the general neighborhood or who the housing is being proposed for, if it's affordable housing. And so, you know, they and others have really focused on the problem of like who's there at the meetings. And your point is exactly right. Like, there's a sort of like who's having a bigger say. It's these folks. You bring up a great point, like that people aren't showing up for all these other sort of structural reasons related to poverty, right? We're having to have a meeting about alleviating poverty or projects that might alleviate poverty, but it's the poverty, the lack of transportation, the sort of time commitments. They're at jobs, they can't get childcare and so on, that's preventing them from going to sort of those meetings. And so a lot of the sort of thinking around this is like, okay, well, how do we get more people at those meetings, or how do we like maybe in my field work, for instance, a couple nonprofits organized buses to get people to go to meetings. And that's cool and that's all right. But I think there's sort of 2 things to think about. The first is a general sort of sense that not everyone may want to participate, and that's okay. And then the second one's gonna be innovative ways to get more ideas and to get harder to reach people. So one is this idea, it's actually in Mario Small's book, Via Victoria. At the beginning, he talks about this when he says, when we talk about community organizations and their work in urban poverty, like we're really not talking about the community. He equates it to like this concept in economics, the 80-20 rule, where basically 20% of a given, in his world, neighborhood are doing 80% of the neighborhood related work. And like that's okay, like that's how it works. And he said, you know, in a place like Via Victoria, which is another neighborhood, it was in the South End in Boston, you know, it's probably more like 90-10 or 95-5, right? 5% of a given neighborhood are doing the neighborhood work or doing 95% of the neighborhood work. And like that's okay. So we should, like, you know, at least acknowledge the fact that like that's cool, or that's all right. The problem, though, is that it's clearly an imbalance here, and it's affecting what happens. And you don't know what you don't know. You don't know why it is that people aren't going, if it is that 95-5, 80-20, or if it's these sort of other structural reasons which we know exist. So to me, I think the real innovation should, come from reimagining this idea of the public meeting, whole hog. Problems with the public meeting: set time, set place, set criteria of the way that things work. You know, generally the structure and culture of the way that these things operate when you go to them is there's chairs there, there's a person in the front, there's like this authority relationship, there's often a presentation followed by a Q&A. It has a sort of rhythm and flow, right? And there's all number of ways where all those things are problematic. On top of all of that, again, it's geared towards, as I was critiquing earlier, this idea of consensus and that the community should have a voice. And as a result, it allows officials or whoever is sort of having authority over those meetings sort of pick and choose which community they want to, based on their own interests, elevate and say, well, that's what the community wanted, and sort of focus on those people and forget everyone else. So let's take all those criteria and just get rid of them, reimagine them. So rather than a set time, rather than a set place, let's have something like Kristin was mentioning, these art installations that could be mobile, moving around a particular neighborhood, capturing people at all times of the day that are walking to work, going to school, doing whatever, and engaging them in what might happen in a particular place. That same group that did that exercise that's in the book also did things where they had sidewalk chalk. You could draw pictures of what you wanted to see in this empty lot, like on the sidewalk in front of the lot, drew people in, brought people that were happening. Again, not set time, not set place. The popsicle stick example, right? Voting on things. There's another really cool example that New York State did, which it was a crowdsourced wiki survey framework. The nuts and bolts are a little bit more detailed. I won't get into that, but basically, you're like voting for different options, and the algorithm is helping rank priorities, and it works better the more ideas and the more voting and more action there is. And again, not set time, not set place. There are barriers with technology and so on and so forth that, you know, I think could be worked around, but also then it's making priorities transparent, right? It's not sort of geared towards this like tunnel vision, one place, one time. So it's almost like take those problems, and rather than like, let's like get people to the meetings, let's sort of get more participation at the meetings. I'm saying let's get rid of the meetings and let's have alternatives of generating input that's guided by more input is better, more transparency over ideas are better. And then what I don't have enough time, of course, right now to talk about, and frankly, I didn't have enough space in the book that I wish I could have talked more about, and Kristin brought this up as well. It's great, cool, marketplace of ideas, awesome, but like that could very, very easily fall into this neoliberal trap of like this assumption that the best ideas will win out, which, you know, is not really often the case. And so I think the next step after all of this is thinking about the space for mobilization, more the sort of grassroots mobilization around particular ideas, even if they aren't the most popular ideas, but the ideas that people think are best, and sort of have that process sort of unfold. So really it's not just a critique of the meetings and how to make meetings better, but a critique of the meetings in a way that like, what's a way to create the information in the absence of meetings, given how, you know, problematic those meetings are in practice.
Yeah, that's great, Jeremy. Well, I want to say thank you so much for you coming and taking the time to talk about the book today and giving us an opportunity to engage it, and Kristin for your great comments on the book, a terrific review. I think I agree with Kristin. Everyone should go out and buy the book. There's a lot to think with, a lot of new and fresh ideas. And I think, Jeremy, what you've really done here is given us a lot of food for thought to think about our, taken for granted assumptions about how we think about community, how we define it as good, no matter what, and how complicated that is. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of nonprofits and the role of organizations and communities. And you've given us a lot to think about elected officials and just, if you couldn't get any bigger, just democracy writ large and rights and representation. So you've done a lot here. So I want to thank you for this treasure of a book. And I want to thank all who have tuned in and participated live, and to the students who submitted questions. We really, really appreciate your insightful contributions and questions.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Kristin.